Captain William Morgan was captain of the War of 1812, after which he decided to expose all the insider information he could of the corruption of the institution of secret combinations, secret societies. Captain William Morgan was a Royal Ark Mason who published a book entitled Illustrations of Masonry, which exposed dangers of secret societies which he had witnessed firsthand, the advantages, special privileges, and dark side influence of every aspect of society, lifting the Masonic combination, like other secret combinations throughout history, into a privileged order under royal names and grand kings, grand sovereigns, and grand high priests. For breaking Masonry prohibitions and exposing Masonry to the public, the master of the Lodge of Masons in Canandaigua, New York, the Empire State, near where John D. Rockefeller's father was born, ordered a Masonic gang to travel 60 miles west and capture Captain William Morgan at his Batavia, New York residence. So, around early sunrise of September 11th, 1826, the mob captured him. The local Mason sheriff and 3 other Masons served prison time over this incident, which suggests they murdered Captain Morgan. For the next 10 to 15 years or so following his murder in 1826, beginning with New York in 1829, Massachusetts in 1833, and Pennsylvania in 1834, these state legislators began investigating Freemasonry, obtaining supportive testimonies from other former Masons as to the nature of the oaths. These investigations conclude that a secret criminal combination empire was overtaking the United States. This happened during John Quincy Adams' presidency, whom Andrew Jackson succeeded in 1829. Their campaign against each other turned into an ugly mudslinging contest. The Mason status of Adams is still unknown today, but Jackson accused him of corruption. Well, people tell on themselves. Captain Morgan told on himself. Andrew Jackson was telling on himself. And all of this happening in the middle of investigations and a rather large awakening of the people to the existence of a secret government taking over politics from the death of Captain Morgan and the aftermath of the book he had published. In the middle of all that, in 1833, John Quincy Adams wrote a letter detailing one of the darkest and most horrific descriptions of Masonry. Have you ever heard, the higher up the ladder, the more your butt shows? Was Adams telling on himself to know so much? Official state legislator investigations didn't start until 1829 under Jackson's cabinet. Was Adams' letter used as a fear tactic, smokescreen to take the heat off of himself? Another distraction and manipulation tactic? Who knows? History can be corrupted over time, so I suspect that my own research may contain flaws as well. I am not the world's leading historian. History is important, and faith teaches us to do all our own due diligence in coming to our own conclusions. Many of us have done our best to do our due diligence. I've done my best to do my due diligence, along with my own personal insights along the way, and that's all I'm presenting here. If you take the Benjamin Franklin approach, take a sheet of paper and write down all the cons on one side and all the pros on the other, basically for every organization in history, you'll begin to see the tree of death and the tree of life. The risk of becoming successful to the point of becoming an elite is whether we can keep our own ego in check, our pride. That's a law of empowerment. Can we stay humble and balanced as we expand in our empowerment? In 1829, right after Andrew Jackson succeeds Adams as president, New York, the Empire State, published the following deception in its revised statutes. In the edition of the laws of the U.S. before referred to, there is an amendment printed as Article 13, prohibiting citizens from accepting titles of nobility or honor or presents, offices, etc., from foreign nations, but by a message from the President of the United States, the 4th of February, 1818, in answer to a resolution of the House of Representatives, it appears that this amendment had been ratified only by 12 states, and therefore had not been adopted. Then, in 1854, 25 years later, the Oregon statutes echo a similar note. Both notes of New York and the copycat note from Oregon refer to the Laws of the United States, first volume, which doesn't even exist in the records of the Library of Congress. First of all, it's suspicious that this first came from New York, the Rockefeller state, and the only one of 27 senators of the United States Senate who voted against it, Mr. Smith. And it's very interesting that the only knowledge of the first volume of Laws of the United States having printed the original as the proposed 13th Amendment in 1789, before it was ratified, actually came from New York. Interesting as it seems that every other existing copy was destroyed and not even on record with the Library of Congress. New York could have presented the several newer printed versions commonly available, which had been printed on and after March 12, 1819, suggesting it was actually ratified by Virginia. But they were resourceful enough to have access to the only printed version stating it was proposed, suggesting only proposed still, and yet with intent to discredit it. And they were rather extremely resourceful, not only for access to an original 1789 version of the laws of the United States, but also extremely resourceful enough to nose their way into finding the president's February 4th, 1818 letter, which wasn't just an accidental misinterpretation, but which they used to distract and manipulate the truth. So, is this how propaganda is used to subvert and create space for abuse? Another point, odds are none of us would have ever known anything about the letter written between President Monroe and Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, dated February 4th, 1818, if it weren't for New York. What does this feel like to you? Subversion? The opposition to the 13th Amendment that came from New York relies solely on the February 4th, 1818 letter between President Monroe and Secretary of State Adams, which only indicated the 13th Amendment had not yet been found to be ratified, according to the records currently in their possession after the war. And 11 years later, these letters were misinterpreted as indicating the 13th Amendment was never ratified. Plus, these letters are out of context without the history of President Monroe being asked by Congress to investigate it December 31st, New Year's Eve, 1817, and not long after he first took office. The fact that they were asking questions just tells us that maybe they did not know yet. And we also proved they had missed two other states that had voted against it as well, Connecticut in 1813 and South Carolina in 1814, which admittedly was not in their records in 1818. So what are the odds, just by chance, they had also missed the one other state who had voted to ratify it? Virginia. The odds are very, very strong. Again, according to the Journal of the Senate of the United States of America, the original vote of the Senate before they sent it out to be ratified by the states was 26 yeas and only one single nay, a Mr. Smith of New York, without which it would have been totally unanimous. Perhaps Agent Smith could shed some light on the subject if he were in our matrix. Let's not tell too many insider jokes meant to be understood only by Matrix movie fans. Unfortunately, the opinion New York created with the misinterpretation of the President Monroe's February 4th letter has persisted to this very day. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. John Quincy Adams was born in 1767. His father, John Adams, served in the Continental Congress and had helped draft the Declaration of Independence and was the second president and only president of the United States who was a Federalist. The Federalist agenda advocated big government, so it didn't last long. John Quincy Adams abandoned the Federalist Party to survive politics. He was introduced to the courts of Europe at 10 years of age, as he accompanied his father on assignment as a special envoy to Europe in 1777. He lived with the French in Paris, the Dutch in Amsterdam, and Russians in St. Petersburg, Russia for 7 years. He returned to Paris in 1783 as secretary for his father through the negotiation of peace ending the American Revolutionary War. 1785, returned home to complete education at Harvard College, graduated 2 years later, maintained a diary from 1779 until 1848, just before his death, which would not likely include anything self-incriminating. Do you think the Rothschilds and their agents may have been interested in becoming friends with him during his younger years in Europe? He admitted to the bar in 1790 and practiced law in Boston. With all the research I've done, I can't find a bar in the United States in 1790. The only bar I can think of is the International Bar Association chartered by the King of England based in London. If he was an esquire from the London bar, that is considered a title of nobility. Perhaps he, along with many of his friends and colleagues, such as from his Harvard days, were afraid they would not be able to even remain a citizen without letting go of special privileges and advantages awarded through their special friendships. 1794, President George Washington, who was a Mason, appointed John Quincy Adams minister to Netherlands, where he served until 1797, and he re-encountered his future foreign-born wife. In 1809, he was the first minister to Russia. He served in Catherine the Great's court and was reassigned to head the 5-person delegation empowered to negotiate the peace agreement ending the War of 1812, and then subsequently posted to the English court for 2 years. It's been about 230 years since George Washington took office, and either 206 years since December 10th, 1812, which was the date New Hampshire very well may have become the 13th state to ratify the original 13th Amendment, or about 200 years since March 12th, 1819, which was the date Virginia voted to include the law in their updated legal code books and printed it in a mega huge way and notified everyone they could think of in government. Even the 2 past presidents got a copy of the Constitution with the original 13th Amendment printed on it. Yet, government leaders have since neglected to recognize it, although it's official law for about 200 years now. James Madison was president from 1809 to 1817 and presided over the War of 1812 against Britain. When the White House and Library of Congress were burnt down in 1814, a second fire at the Library of Congress, December 24th, 1851, destroyed 2/3 of its books. It's been over 100 years since
Secretary of State Philander Knox committed fraud when he declared the 16th Amendment ratified, which the Fed and the IRS have used to entrench themselves and to move forward in 1913. Over time, the need for the original 13th Amendment has become more and more obvious. Politicians continue to line their pockets with both money and honors from special interests in foreign private entities and countries. The validity of the Title of Nobility Amendment is one that many attorneys and judges of today are obviously not in favor of, because it would remove their special privileges. The American Bar Association was set up by 1878 and patterned after the International Bar Association, chartered by the King of England, based in London and heavily associated with the international banking system. Well, attorneys and judges have a title of nobility, esquire, and honor, which are expressly prohibited by the original 13th Amendment. The truth is, if you hire an attorney, you can show up in court, and if the judge is breaking his judicial canons right and left, destroying your case and thereby injuring you financially, emotionally, and physically, your attorney will most likely refuse to sue the judge for you. Most attorneys have been taught and trained that they can't sue a judge. The attorneys are trained to protect the judge before they even protect you. Does that sound messed up? From a young age, I've had a personal interest in law. By the time I was 24, I'd been injured by a couple of judges who were breaking their judicial canons right in front of me, as if it were a kangaroo court. So I decided to sue these two judges in federal court. I wasn't an attorney. I didn't even know what I was even getting involved with. I had studied the law a little as a matter of personal interest, without hurting anybody, just defending myself. I witnessed the blatant behavior of judges as if they'd made up their own rules without regard to the actual law, disturbing not only my laws of peace, but they were hurting lots of other people too. And I felt I had to step up and speak up, not just for me, but for my community. So I wrote up what I thought was a fairly strong brief, and the Attorney General of the state was assigned as their protector and attorney to defend them. Early on in the first hearing, I knew I wasn't going to win. But because I made such a strong case, they decided to look much further into things. To my surprise, they busted both judges red-handed doing cocaine. They will never be a judge again, and every case they've ever tried can be retried if someone were so inclined to do the right paperwork. Don't break your judicial canons if you're a judge, because you may not get away with it. They may get away with it 1,000 times, but all it takes is the one time they get caught. When things go far enough out of balance, I believe God steps in sometimes to help us balance things out. It's the way it is. One of the best ways to win a battle is not to have one. Sort of like Bruce Lee, the art of fighting without fighting. But if we're too passive, we enable our abusers. We must learn to pick our battles when it's the right time to stand up and speak up. It's not worth winning a battle while we lose the war.